Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming out on this rainy day. It's very good to have you here. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm the acting executive vice president here at the United States Institute of Peace, and we're very pleased to welcome you to the building and in particular to this forum, this Conflict Prevention and Resolution Forum of Washington, D.C. And we extend a special welcome to those who are joining us live via live stream broadcast. You can all communicate with one another and the wider world about this event via Twitter at hashtag CPRF, if you want to do that. As many of you know, and people in this room, the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Forum provides a monthly platform in Washington for highlighting innovative and constructive methods of resolving conflict. Established in 1999, the forum's goals are to, 1, provide information from a wide variety of perspectives, 2, explore possible solutions to complex conflicts, and 3, provide a venue for professionals from various disciplines to engage in cross-sector and multi-track problem solving. I'd like to especially thank Mr. Eric Rosand, Director of the CVE Summit Coordination Cell. I want to get this title right. I want people to make note of that this is not what you had in your programs, but as the director of the CVE Summit Coordination Cell across the street at the State Department. So we're very pleased to have Eric come across. The forum is co-sponsored by a consortium of organizations represented by many of you in this room that specialize in conflict resolution or public policy formulation. In addition to USIP, our partner organizations include Search for Common Ground, the Alliance for Peace Building, American University's International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program, George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Johns Hopkins University's Conflict Management Program, and the NITSE School of Advanced International Studies, Partners for Democratic Change, and Georgetown University Conflict Resolution Program. Welcome to all of you who represent those organizations. And we want to thank you for your partnership with us. This is a great joint undertaking. For those of you who are joining us in this building for the first time here at USIP, Congress established us 30 years ago this year and funds us as a research center for training, practice, preventing, resolving, and transforming violent conflict. Violent extremism is a global threat. From the recent university attack in Kenya, the razing of villages by Boko Haram in Nigeria, the shootings at Bardo Museum in Tunisia, the universal flow of fighters to Iraq and Syria, the senseless killing of school children in Pakistan, to the attacks on Rohingya minorities by Buddhist extremists. The United States Institute of Peace has now made the issue of violent extremism a core part of our organization. Acting Vice President Colette Roush and Georgia Homer are now leading this effort. We will host another Peace Game in June in partnership with Foreign Policy Magazine and the Kennedy School of Government, which will focus precisely on the issue of violent extremism and the strategies that help prevent it. George Lopez, sitting right down here, the Vice President of the USIP's Academy, is organizing that game for us. The peace building we do at USIP, the tools we develop, the strategies we test and refine, the research we conduct, the partnerships we cultivate are all deeply relevant to creating an effective and sustainable strategy to prevent violent extremism. In our experience, the long-term factors necessary for stable, just peace, such as strong governance, inclusive political processes, accountable and responsive justice and security systems, are central components of an effective CVE strategy. We have also found through our years in conflict prevention that strengthening resilience at both the community and state levels is key, and that success is rooted in building capacity and linkages among a broad range of civil society and state actors. Much of our work in CVE is done in partnership with the Department of State and USAID, and implemented by our partners in the field. We have worked to bring together women interfaith leaders and police in Nigeria and Kenya to build trust and jointly address security issues. In this way, we support models of community engagement that are inclusive and fully owned locally. We have developed training curricula for the Hidayah Center for International Excellence on CVE in media usage, community engagement, and policing, and in rule of law for the Malta Institute of International Justice. We have worked to support security sector reform in North Africa, in the Sahel, and so that those who are responsible to stop terrorism are not contributing further to the problem. We have provided support to CVE pilot programming in Pakistan and Afghanistan, resulting in a range of innovative community-level counter-narrative programs in the media, in the arts, and in education. We help reach youth in ways that matter and provide viable alternatives to the messages of violent extremism. We have conducted research on the factors that contribute to and help mitigate the influence of violent extremism, informing thoughtful programming and promoting a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which communities can be less vulnerable to violent extremism. So this conversation today is important. We in the peace-building community have much to contribute to the discussion of CVE. We recognize that, like peace and democracy, efforts to strengthen a society's ability to resist and recover from violent extremism are not battles to be won or lost. We understand that solutions must be holistic, thoughtful, and long-term. So we at USIP are delighted to host this month's forum, and I'm now very pleased to turn the floor over to Senior Program Officer Candice Karp from the USIP Academy to introduce the speakers and to chair today's session. Candice.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much, Bill. I'd like to introduce Eric Rosand, who, as Bill stated, is the director of the CVE Summer Coordination Cell at the State Department, Lina Schlack-Mulder, who's vice president of programs at Search for Common Ground, and Nadia Gaspaka, who's the director of security sector education at USIP Academy. But before I ask Eric to speak first, our goal here today is to have a very early assessment of CVE programs to determine hopeful paths for future programming. CVE is a new field, and we don't presume to have all the answers just yet. To frame the issue at hand, violent extremism is inspired, justified, and associated with an extreme political, religious, or social ideology. Violent extremists are driven by narrow interpretations of issues and grievances and often exploit and harness their agenda to larger conflict dynamics. There are challenges that are increasingly evident. The challenges of weak state legitimacy, authority, and capacity, and the challenge of communities which have fractured to the point where they can't manage their relationships, and therefore they are no longer able to self-regulate for the benefit of the community as a whole. Violent extremism flourishes in both these environments. Is this where CVE programming is most effective? There's the challenge of articulating the drivers of violent extremism. We know that inequality, discrimination, and marginalization each play their part, but we also know that the journey towards radicalization and violent extremism for an individual is deeply, deeply personal, and perhaps even unique to that individual. In this context, how can research define the criteria for identifying those who are most at risk of radicalization and involvement in violent extremism? There's the challenge of articulating how violent extremism differs from other forms of violence, including those that may have cultural resonance. Is it that violent extremism is different because it threatens the social fabric of a community and the social relations in that community? There's the challenge of articulating the difference between countering and preventing violent extremism. Is it that countering violent extremism is more fraught politically because the need is immediate, and the issue of violent extremism is highly sensitive for many governments struggling to retain authority and control? There are also trends, or perhaps philosophies is a better word, which are increasingly evident. For example, the philosophy that government and non-government actors are equally important when countering violent extremism. The philosophy that fence-sitters, those who remain undecided as to where their loyalties lie, are the optimal target audience for CVE programming. And finally, there's the philosophy which links narratives to networks. We can't talk about narratives or counter-narratives without first recognizing that networks and the people in them sustain the message. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric for his perspective.
Thank you, Candice, and USIP for hosting this important event on this increasingly salient topic. The recent attacks from Kenya to Tunisia to Pakistan to Denmark to France remind us of the spread of violent extremism and that no country or community is immune, and that's obviously become a truism. Intelligence officials are arguing now that terrorism trend lines are worse than at any other time in modern history. And so despite all the tactical successes that we've had in the past more than decade of our intelligence, military, and law enforcement efforts, the violent extremism that radicalizes, recruits, and mobilizes people, especially young people, to engage in terrorism has unfortunately continued to spread. And so more than ever, the perspective is that a comprehensive strategy to address the underlying drivers that fuel the appeal and spread of this violent extremism, and one where local actors, whether municipal governments, families, neighbors, faith leaders, youth, women, play a vital role. This is essential. And that's precisely why last September, in his remarks at the UN General Assembly, President Obama issued a call to action for governments and non-government stakeholders alike to do more to address the political, economic, and social drivers of this violent extremism and to report on progress this coming September in New York. And that's also why the President in February brought together more than 300 senior officials, experts from the private sector, civil society, governments, multilateral bodies, to catalyze a global effort against violent extremism by generating new innovative ideas and programs, mobilizing new resources, and building new partnerships that are so critical not only to countering today's threats, but preventing people from radicalizing, recruiting, or inspiring others to violence in the first place. And this is why the President and others outlined an ambitious action agenda across a wide range of topics to guide the effort in the coming months and years, and have leaders gather in New York this fall to report on the progress made on this positive, preventative agenda. So this morning, I want to elaborate briefly on this agenda and explain how we at the State Department are working with partners across the globe to build what we hope will be a durable global partnership against violent extremism. So the action agenda, it built on the core themes of President Obama's February remarks, as well as on the interventions from the gathering at the February summit, where more than 60 countries, civil society leaders from 53 countries, secretaries general from the UN, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the African Union, etc., representatives from technology and other industries joined together. And there are 9 cross-cutting topics in this agenda. And incidentally, many of these topics are ones that USIP, as both Candace and Bill highlighted, are working actively in. The first is the need to gain a better understanding of the precise nature of violent extremism threats at the local and regional level, and of what interventions have proven effective in building community resilience to the spread of violent extremism. We need to do a better job of encouraging and carrying out local research that will help understand what makes particular communities vulnerable to violent extremism. We need to identify communities at the subnational level and within cities that are at the risk of radicalization to violence. And we need to study the factors that drive violent extremism within these specific communities, along with the potential impact of possible responses. We need to ensure that the research findings are accessible to and actionable for policymakers, practitioners, and the communities themselves. And we, of course, need to develop better tools with which to monitor and evaluate the impact of CVE projects. All of this is needed to facilitate more targeted and effective interventions against violent extremism. Second, we need to deepen our engagement with and empower youth, women, and civil society more broadly as CVE actors, and help ensure that civil society has an enabling environment to develop, promote, and advance comprehensive solutions to address violent extremism, and that laws and policies designed to address violent extremism are not being used to stifle the enjoyment of freedoms of expression, a peaceful assembly, and association or movement. For example, we need to approach youth not just as the beneficiaries of, but also partners in our CVE efforts. Research shows that young people are more likely to listen to and be influenced by their peers. And when we refer to quote-unquote credible voices, youth are the key credible actor. We need to work to identify concrete ways to support youth-led initiatives to counter the narratives of violent extremists and to offer positive alternatives. As youth are often more technologically savvy than their parents, They can play a vital role in social media in pushing back on ISIL's attraction in their own voices. And in their communities, schools, and universities, we can support and empower youth as social and civic leaders and mentors who can offer other options to susceptible peers. Women, as we know, can also have a unique role to play in preventing and countering violent extremism in families and communities because of their knowledge, position, and access as mothers, aunts, sisters, daughters. And more work is needed to build the capacity and more broadly empower women community leaders to recognize the signs of radicalization among family and community members and techniques for how to intervene preventatively. Third, the action agenda highlights how more attention needs to be given to build trust and strengthen cooperation between communities vulnerable to radicalization and the police and security forces that are charged with protecting them. Where people see law enforcement as a threat, it will take a concerted effort to improve relationships. We need to expand efforts to educate government officials and security sector practitioners on the negative impact of human rights violations on efforts to address violent extremism and national security, and that enhanced respect for human rights will in fact enhance both national security and, of course, the effort against terrorism. And we have to ensure that police forces get the specialized training they need to engage with local communities, to build relationships with these communities, and to work with those that are at risk of radicalization without inflaming the radicalization. And the Global Counterterrorism Forum, a new multilateral platform that the U.S. helped launch a few years ago, has developed a set of good practices and an action plan in this area that could underpin scaled-up training on community police and community security force relations. Fourth, the action agenda stresses that we must identify and scale up existing strategies and techniques to counter violent extremist messaging and narratives as an essential element of a counterterrorism strategy for addressing violent extremism. To this end, more attention should be given to supporting credible, diverse local allies and potential partners to develop and disseminate their own counter messages and alternative narratives or to amplify existing ones. We will work to institutionalize and expand web-based engagement efforts to help credible religious, women, youth, community, and other civil society leaders expose the negative aspects of terrorist organizations among key demographics in their communities and network in online spaces. Fifth, we must continue to highlight the important role that civic education, critical thinking, and life skills can play on creating a bulwark against violent extremist recruitment. This could involve engaging proactively with educational institutions that offer at-risk youth particular opportunities and provide critical thinking skills and trainings as alternatives to violent extremism. And here again, the Global Counterterrorism Forum's Abu Dhabi Memorandum captures specific good practices on the role of education and CVE that could form the basis of expanded training and broader capacity building programs in this area. Sixth, we need to increase the availability and appeal of classical religious learning in order to counteract the distortions, decontextualized sound bites, and extremist interpretations circulating in the hands of radical groups. This could involve providing media training to mainstream religious scholars and associated educational institutions, including social media and other online platforms, to enable purveyors of nonviolence and tolerance to compete more effectively in the crowded marketplace of ideas. All of this is necessary because, as we know, radical groups and movements often take advantage of the fact that those they are targeting for recruitment and indoctrination frequently have little to no grounding in mainstream religious knowledge and push their views out through social media, short videos, and online courses. Seventh, we must not only intensify efforts to prevent radicalization in prisons, which have served as hotbeds for violent extremist recruitment for many years, but also to facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of violent extremists and those that are returning from foreign fighters who are returning from Iraq and Syria, who are not eligible for prosecution. Again, drawing on Global Counterterrorism Forum and here UN good practices and experiences from post-conflict disarmament, demobilization and reintegration programs in places like Colombia and Northern Ireland, countries are being encouraged to develop unique programs to facilitate this rehabilitation and reintegration in the context of incarcerated violent extremists and returning foreign terrorist fighters. And we need to gain a better understanding of why violent extremists or returning foreign terrorist fighters disengage as we look to improve the effectiveness of exit and diversion programs. Eighth, we must continue to see expanding political, economic, and educational opportunities, particularly for marginalized and disaffected populations. If we are to be serious about wanting to reduce the pool of people who are susceptible to the messages and narratives of violent extremists, then we need to start by giving them a stake in their societies in which they're living and to ensure that governments are being responsive to the legitimate needs of their people. In this context, we need to also look to the private sector to expand its role in CVE, whether through targeted vocational, social entrepreneurship, social media, or other training or education initiatives that the private sector can help resource. And finally, we must explore how development and other relevant foreign assistance can contribute to addressing populations most at risk of co-optation or recruitment by violent extremists and the conditions conducive to radicalization to violence. Here, for example, we could start adapting counterterrorism and broader national security strategies to incorporate development-based approaches strategically focused on addressing the drivers of violent extremism and elaborating an action plan under which interested development entities, international development entities, could tailor existing and design new development assistance initiatives and programs aimed to address violent extremism. This is an enormous agenda that brings together a whole range of issues that are often treated separately. And so one of the advantages of the contributions of the CVE Summit in February was, I think for the first time, perhaps to link all these areas in some way to this violent extremist agenda or countering violent extremism agenda. And it offers the international community, whether governments, non-governments, public, private, a common comprehensive framework for building and sustaining this global partnership against violent extremism in the context of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. There are all sorts of initiatives that can be pursued, some with the CVE label on them, others without the label on them, all of which can be mutually reinforcing and advancing this agenda. And so in terms of going forward, we at the State Department, working with our partners, are working to identify a few areas of the action agenda that each country can try to take forward and make progress on in the coming months, so that when their leaders come to New York in September, they can report on this progress. There'll be a series of regional summits starting in mid-May and running through the end of July in places like Albania, Algeria, Australia, Denmark, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Nepal, Norway, and elsewhere, that will allow us to make progress on this agenda at the regional and local level and bring in more non-government partners along the way. The idea is to grow the network of youth, women, religious, and other civil society leaders, as well as the private sector that are involved in this space, so that we can tap into their innovation and other talents in communities that need to play a much larger role in tackling the violent extremist challenge. A Washington-based NGO and CVE Summit participant, the Global Center on Cooperative Security, has established a website, www.cvesummit.org, to update the growing number of stakeholders involved in this process on the developments in the effort, and with a calendar of events, and to allow the community to stay connected. And while we're very focused on September, we're also looking beyond September to ensure the sustainability of this effort even through the end of this administration. So we're working to strengthen the partnership with the UN, the African Union, the OIC, the OSCE, all sorts of regional organizations. For example, the United Nations is developing its first ever plan of action for preventing violent extremism, which will harness the considerable expertise and resources of the UN family in this effort, and hopefully appoint the first ever special representative for the Secretary General on countering violent extremism. And all this will be rolled out in New York this fall. The World Economic Forum and the Club for Democracies are going to launch multi-stakeholder dialogues that are geared toward generating innovative solutions against violent extremism by building on the expertise of non-government actors in the private sector and civil society. Several participants in the February summit commented on how the meeting was a milestone in the global effort against violent extremism and a turning point, we hope, for the U.S. in moving forward toward a holistic approach that embraces marginalized communities, as well as the role of civil society and the private sector. And the challenge we all face now is to build on this momentum so that it produces practical and tangible outcomes. And it's an opportunity to supplement, expand, and innovate, not only in the context of our efforts to deal with ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other existing terrorist networks, but to prevent the threats from emerging in the next generation. And so at the summit, Secretary Kerry announced that we can send a clear signal to the next generation that its future will not be defined by the agenda of the terrorists and the violent ideology that sustains them. We will not cower, and we will prevail by working together. Our collective security depends on our collective response. And so when leaders reconvene at the General Assembly this fall, they will have a historic opportunity to consolidate the comprehensive whole-of-society effort against violent extremism that we believe will pay dividends both in the short and long term, and certainly cannot be an effort that governments alone move forward on. In fact, at the end of the day, it's the non-government actors that have the most important role to play here. So thank you very much again for giving us the platform to talk about this initiative.
Thank you very much. Lena?
Okay, good morning, everybody, and I'm really very, very pleased to be here with you this morning. I knew that I was going to follow after Eric, and you couldn't have paved the way better. Search for Common Ground across the world where we work in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We really feel very much aligned with the outcome of the CVE Summit, and what I want to share with you today is what does it look like when we engage in this programming to counter violent extremism, and equally importantly, how do we know it's working? How are we measuring this so that we can actually begin to grow this field, enhance its credibility, and feel very aligned behind this kind of work? So I'm going to talk to you about 4 pillars of CVE in the way that at Search for Common Ground we're defining this: prevention, disengagement, improving state responses, and amplifying new narratives. So the prevention piece really comes back to the heart of peacebuilding's contribution to countering violent extremism. As Eric said, and as many of you have also, I'm sure, read and learned, the core drivers of violent extremism are rooted in issues around grievances, in issues around participation, in issues around how people work across dividing lines, and how the messages of violent extremists are actually resonating with people's own sense of identity and their aspirations. So for example, on the top left, we have been working in KPK and FATA in Pakistan, enabling young people to be able to hold a space of dialogue and solution seeking with their local governments and with the members of their community. So this has enabled them to be able to step into spaces in an area where the Taliban is very present and actually engage different stakeholders and feel as though they have a role and a stake in their future. On the right, you'll see our recently merged organization with Search for Common Ground, Solia, which has been a pioneer in setting up virtual exchange and who seeks to make cross-cultural exchange a part of every university student's experience around the world. So in more than 40 countries right now, young people are going through a cross-cultural facilitated dialogue, which enables them to understand others' experiences and have difficult and yet facilitated discussions around some of the key issues that often promote the myths and stereotypes that can feed into adhesion to a violent extremism network. Conversations around religion, conversations around 9/11, conversations around politics globally and in the Middle East. And over here, from northern Nigeria, we are working with young people and religious leaders and women to enable a Christian-Muslim dialogue to take place so that we can set up what we're calling a peace architecture and actually begin to ask ourselves, how can we as citizens contribute to security in our community? The prevention piece also involves interreligious dialogue. while we do not see religion as the problem, we see religion as having an opportunity to reach out to people and speak to what parts of their identity are perhaps feeling vulnerable or feeling in need of some type of reinforcement through adhesion to a more violent extremist ideology. And so our work with religious leaders on the top left around the Holy Sites Project is very, very important. On the right there are young people from Tunisia, where in all 26 governorates, we have set up youth councils with young people who really represent a diverse profile between more secular and more Islamist and more active and less active youth, who through coaching and training are able to engage with their local authorities, hold round tables, begin to take collaborative action, not only around peace and security, but around issues that concern them, and to begin to feel it as partners in their future. And media is also another role. I'll come to that a little bit later on. But again, all of this prevention work for Search for Common Ground is the kind of work that we've been doing for 35 years. It's the kind of work that we were doing in the Quartier Populaire of Bujumbura when there was violent extremism between Hutus and Tutsis. And so our work in the prevention pillar is really the core of what we're doing and continues in all of our regions. So what does it look like when we're measuring success in this, okay? Because all of our work is actually measured through ongoing monitoring, midterm and final evaluations. So we've been able to establish indicators that are being able to demonstrate that the grievances that people have are being addressed through nonviolent channels. That marginalized groups, obviously after having done a proper mapping, are actually engaged in the conversation. And that young people in particular, who we've identified as being vulnerable to extremist narratives, are particularly engaged. We're measuring new relationships across dividing lines, and those may be across religious dividing lines, they may be tribal, they may be regional, etc. We're able to measure that those relationships improve, and then we're also able to measure what people's attitudes and beliefs are and how those are shifting through the experiential nature of this prevention work. The second pillar of our work is disengagement, right? There's a number of states around the world that have actually been quite effective in arresting and imprisoning people who have been accused of terrorist acts. One of those places is Indonesia, where they've arrested more than 800 people for terrorist-related crimes. And we know that in prisons, it's both an opportunity and a risk. An opportunity for people to begin to explore new perspectives on the world, to begin to reflect on the choices they've made. But it can also be a place where people actually harden their views, become further entrenched in their silos. And as we know, people have even orchestrated further terrorist acts from their prison cells. So our work, particularly in Indonesia and Morocco, has enabled us to firstly work with the prison authorities to enable them to feel more confident and comfortable about how they need to deal with these high-risk prisoners. In most of these prisons, they're not separating these prisoners, and yet they, as prison officials, are aware that they're not necessarily dealing with these prisoners in a way that enables them to contribute, engage, and participate in the normal activities. So our disengagement works firstly with the prison officials, and then we bring in other types of trainers from civil society, and interestingly in Morocco, from a network of religious leaders who then come and engage with the prisoners in a way to begin to explore issues around identity and self-esteem and the eventual return and reintegration into society. So what are we measuring in this disengagement field? We're measuring how the prison officials firstly accept, understand, and then use these skills in managing prisoners better who've been convicted of terrorism. The prison officials themselves, according to our evaluations, are able to see that this group of prisoners, before the intervention with Search for Common Ground, were not speaking to anybody, would not participate, would not come to the activities. They can see that that shift has been made, and that's able to be measured. And as a result, these high-risk prisoners have exposure to diverse perspectives around their extremist narratives. And that can be through just simply engaging with other prisoners, as well as the religious leaders who come, the conflict transformation trainers, and the prison officials who now have a higher degree of sensitization around these issues. And the fourth result that is emerging more and more from this work is that because we're engaging religious leaders with this very sensitive target group, the religious leaders themselves are better understanding what it is that is at the root of some of that adherence to violent extremist ideologies. And they themselves, thus, in the good feedback loop, are able to sort of take those lessons, apply them back with that population, but also with people outside of prison. The third pillar of our work is improving state responses. I'd mentioned that there are effective counterterrorism police and security forces. One of them is Densus 88 in Indonesia. And in their work in tracking and arresting and conducting raids around the country to capture people suspected or having committed acts of terrorism, they have also fallen to a great degree of scrutiny by human rights organizations. These organizations have criticized their actions for being wrongly targeted, for using torture, for perhaps turning to persecuting the family members of people when they're unable to find the actual target of their surveillance. And so what we've done is we've recognized with Densus 88 and with the human rights organizations that there's a need for dialogue. There's a need for dialogue to begin to understand what are we saying, what are our values, what are the principles that we hold true to ourselves as Densus 88 and as human rights groups. And the result of this over many years has been extraordinary. We've been able to see that the human rights groups have been sensitized to some of the dilemmas that a highly capable counterterrorism unit faces. At the same time, the people at Densus 88 have reinforced their training in human rights for their troops, but also have recognized that there's not just a sort of a training in sort of the human rights principles that's needed, but really a greater sensitization to the counter effect that their negative actions that violate human rights can have on their own effectiveness. So together through the dialogue that Search for Common Ground has been facilitating, we're able to see a common code of conduct emerging, whereby the human rights organizations recognize and accept the role of the counterterrorism force, and the counterterrorism force as well understand to what degree they need to respect human rights because they now see it in their interest. This kind of work is underway in many countries around the world. In northern Nigeria, we're having a similar work with human rights groups, actually first to enable them to work more effectively as human rights defenders, and then to engage in dialogue with the security forces, right? So the goal is the same in terms of enabling people to see themselves as having a shared interest, and thus to diminish the possibility of these security forces' efforts being discredited by human rights groups, but also enabling the security forces to recognize that a couple bad moves is going to end up discrediting them and will cut off future allies and alliances in their seeking of to counter violent extremism. On the bottom here, we have a very historic group of people convened by Search for Common Ground in Kyrgyzstan, where over the last 2 years, we've been able to bring together for the first time, a completely extraordinary and unusual group of officials ranging from police to ministries to the state-run religious affairs ministry to other religious institutions to begin to explore what is our understanding of the drivers of violent extremism in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia. How can we work together around this? And this picture came towards the end of this last phase of the project where we actually extended this dialogue to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. And these are people from the police forces from all of those countries who, frankly, we were surprised and enthused by the fact that they came, which is already one of the indicators of success. And the testimony that we've received after this phase of work has really enabled us to see that it's by understanding where people's interests can be shared that really common action can be pursued. On the top right is actually a picture from Lebanon, where we have a pilot project underway with the ISF, the police in Beirut, to begin to build bridges with the youth. And while this project is not really framed for Search for Common Ground in the sense of violent extremism, for me, it's very, very clear that as we build bridges between young people and police officers, on the left, it's the same work that is underway in Nepal, we're actually going to be able to help people work together towards combating extremism in a way that is not always evident. So what are we measuring in this pillar of our work, right? The forum for stakeholders to come across dividing lines and find a common approach is the first indicator of success. We all are peace builders, and we know how difficult it is to get people in the room. And when we actually are able to have that dialogue between Densas 88 and the human rights groups, or between the Kyrgyz and Uzbek and Tajik all together, it is a phenomenal success already. The second indicator that we're measuring is how much are the non-state actors that either have been or are at risk of discrediting these state actions, how is their approach shifting? How are they better able to collaborate with the security forces? How are they perhaps rendering more sophisticated their approaches beyond simply denouncing the abuses of these security forces? And that's another area that we're measuring as we continue to engage with these non-state actors. We thirdly do see that the knowledge and application of human rights principles by security forces is another thing that we're able to measure. In Kyrgyzstan, not only did we bring people together for a dialogue, but they were actually able to agree on a curriculum for police and security sector training in Kyrgyzstan, like people from a wide sector actually agreeing on a curriculum. They were also able to agree on the production of 2 films that talk about the history of Islam and the nature of jihad in Central Asia. And imagine a film that needs to be produced and have 25 or 30 different rounds of reviews. So we see that as a real success in our ability to find some areas of common ground. So that's also number 4, that higher collaboration between non-state actors. And often it's when we actually attempt to do something together that we recognize better where the barriers are and where we need to reinforce that collaboration. And with the example that I just mentioned, there's a shared narrative that's disseminated. The film that we produced was broadcast all over the country. It's now being used in community dialogue screenings. And it's a film that reflects a narrative that the Ministry of Interior and the Muftiat and the local civil society organizations all feel good about. So that's a huge success. The last pillar is amplifying a new narrative. Again, I kind of avoid the word countering, and I'll get to that at the end. But I really see this about the amplification of important, credible voices that can enable us to debunk the myths and the conspiracies, and to enable people to hear new perspectives around things that may be resonating, again, with their own sense of identity and what they're looking for as they move towards extremist ideologies. So on the top left is from Indonesia. We targeted 10 pesantrens, Islamic boarding schools, in areas where there had been terrorist action. We worked with those students, set up radio stations within the pesantrens, but also enabled them to make their own documentary films. Films that explored identity, films that explored what does it mean to be a Muslim, films that explored what's going on with other faith groups. And those films were then able to be shown in festivals, to be screened in the communities. And apart from the transformative effect that that had, obviously, on young people who had never used a camera before in some instances, it also was able to reflect out to the community that if you thought that the pesantrens was a breeding ground of terrorists, well, look again. And those films are online. They're absolutely beautiful. If you want to take a look at them, you can find them through Search for Common Ground. On the right is an imam from Morocco. His name is Imam El Mortada, and he's someone who really identifies with the Salafi tradition, and had been very much frustrated with the way in which the young people in his community were feeling, and was sort of really gaining prominence and being a sort of a more radical voice in his community. He engaged with the youth councils in Morocco, similarly to what we're doing in Tunisia. And through different activities, he began to understand the difference between conflict and violence, the different ways of having voice and contributing to collaborative solutions. And he began to be more also comfortable with people of diverse viewpoints. And he has, through that experience, been very vocal and very active on his own Facebook page, speaking at public events. He's been honored in different forums. But what's interesting with Imam al-Mortada is that the same people that were his fans in the earlier version of Mortada are still his fans today. So for us, that's really an example of how really working with key messengers who are already credible can really shift the narrative. Two more quick examples. Common Ground News Service is something that Search for Common Ground ran for about 12 years, which was a weekly news service bringing out new and alternative voices, primarily around US and majority Muslim countries. It was distributed to thousands and thousands of newspapers around the world in 5 languages. And that news service every single week reminded us that beyond the headlines, there are other perspectives. And not only would we curate these articles, but we would also go to people like Imam al-Mortada, or go to people who were in KPK and Fatah and say, we'd like to hear your voice. Can you write an op-ed for us? And that work of the Common Ground News Service was a wonderful model, and we're trying now to see in which way we can bring that out using not just print media. The last example is Under the Same Sun, which is the first feature film that Search for Common Ground produced. It was a mockumentary set in a day where there actually is peace between Israel and Palestine. And through the screenings that we did, particularly in Jewish film festivals across North America, we were able as well to be able to open a conversation around new possibilities and new ways of thinking about this very entrenched conflict. So amplifying new narratives can be through news, through op-eds, through fiction, through comic books, through feature films, and how are we measuring that change? Firstly, we need to make sure that we have the reach, that we have the penetration, right? So we need to understand, is the media that we're produced simply preaching to the converted, or are we actually able to reach to the people who most need that? We're able then to understand that people who've consumed, who've accessed that media, are they actually shifting to new narratives? And interestingly, are the followers of people like Imam al-Mortada following him through his own transformation away from extremism? Number 3 is obviously that all of these are about empathy with the other. If we look at the stories of extremists and the stories and the books and the films that have been done on them, they themselves really speak to that turning point of actually being able to empathize with the other as a key factor behind their move away from extremism. Myths, conspiracies, and stereotypes are debunked, and we create the rallying points for this moderate majority. So new narratives is obviously a lot around media, but in many of our programs we're doing solidarity activities. In Central African Republic, where there's been extremism by both Christians and Muslims, we've done week after week after week of festivals, because it's not an environment which we're going to penetrate through social media, but we get people dancing and singing and doing theater together every week, because that is a place where people are going to say, okay, I know that I've lost my family because of this or that group, but on my doorstep, there's people from both groups actually celebrating together. So the tactics around new narratives really can change. And the last thing I want to say is that at Search for Common Ground, although we do really align with the action plan that came out of the CVE summit, and it feels wonderful to really feel as though with the State Department we're going to be able to do good work, we also are very clear that our work needs to be without judgment. And that it's the recognition that people make choices and that no one is born a terrorist that is going to really make us do our work effectively. The minute that we begin to try to demonstrate or articulate or reflect that we feel one of these groups in this environment is wrong and needs to be changed, the effectiveness of our intervention will be undermined. And so this, is really part of the values and the approach of Search for Common Ground in recognizing our common humanity and recognizing our interdependence And so as we continue to do this work and grow it around the world, we will really continue to be true to that underlying principle of our common humanity. Thank you.
Nadia?
Good morning. I feel like everything that Eric said, I can just finish my presentation by saying, yes, we do that. But let me tell you a little bit more about how we're working to contribute to the CV agenda here at USIP. My task here is to tell you about a piece of what we do here at USIP, which is the work of the Academy that has been that started about 2.5 years ago to contribute to the CV agenda. As Ambassador Taylor and Candace already mentioned, USIP is engaged in a lot of different fronts, where a lot of different programs here at USIP are engaging in CV. So I'm going to talk to you about a piece of it. So the USIP Academy has a program of instruction that really our goal is to give tools to people in various countries that are facing violent extremist threats to have the tools so they have the capacity to counter violent extremism in their own environments. We do that by engaging both government actors and civil society actors and communities. But we really focus on a capacity building approach. So we're really working on what kind of tools, what kind of skills, what kind of knowledge do we need to impart to the various actors with whom we work in the various sectors, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. What kind of tools do they need so they can do, address this threat that they face every day. So the premise of our work is that a lot of what drives violent extremism is exclusion, structural inequality, discrimination, marginalization, being left out, not being able to contribute or participate in society. We see this from Paris to all over sub-Saharan Africa and all over the world. So that's where we're working, and which shows which is the logic for why we engage governments and try to build the capacity of governments and not just civil society. So we believe that fragile states suffer from a breakdown of a social contract, and what we're trying to do is to reinstate and fix the fractured relationships that exist in society that Candace mentioned earlier. So our approach is to help various actors in countries that face violent extremism, which, as Eric said, is basically everyone around the world, are the most, we believe that's most effective when governance structures, entire governance structures are built. And they have the capacity to address grievances and the capacity to deliver services so that grievances can be either addressed or we can even prevent grievances arising. So the work that we do, the programs that we have are about reinstating a social contract. So what we're working on is to help various actors engage in or have the capacity to choose nonviolent paths. And that means that we're talking about a couple of different sectors, public sectors, so we have privileged and chosen to work with the security sector, specifically the police, and I'll talk a little bit more about the program there, and the education sector. We look at those sectors as both being able to radicalize or at best not prevent the radicalization. We all know the security forces can serve as a radicalization force, and education institutions can also serve as radicalization forces. So we really want to make sure that we engage those and we give them the capacity to at least not radicalize, and then develop the tools to give the capacity of various actors to engage in a nonviolent ways, communicate their grievances and those kinds of things. So how do we do that? We work to focus on a couple of different capacities. One, messaging. We've already heard about messaging, branding, messaging, and narratives. Providing the skills to people so they can develop a new language for enhanced CVE capacity. That means that maybe in social media, or that when the police goes out and does an operation that requires some, maybe some weapons, some force, things like that, that it's done in a way in which it's communicated to the community, communicated to various actors, what the rule of law, context provides for those types of operations. We give them the ability to communicate to the community, to explain to the community, to educate the community on what they're doing. And we ask them to also develop the capacity to self-reflect and think about their own operations and whether they are, unfolding the way they should and in a way that doesn't further radicalize. We ask our participants to learn to address stress and trauma so they can build resilience, so that they can engage in collective activities to resist calls for recruitment or a variety of other CV type, violent extremism type of activities. We also work to address distortion of values. Various interpretations of various narratives. We really distort values, so how do we address those? And then we also teach our participants how to establish long-term partnerships between citizens and their governments. So that's sort of the focus that underpins all the different programs that I'm about to talk about. Our theory of change is really that the government capacity to provide fair and responsive public services increases, then we'll see that marginalization and radicalization will decrease, and societal resilience against violent extremism will increase. This is just something that allows us to craft our curriculum and deliver a particular content in a way that is coordinated across the programs. Here in the Academy at USIP, we have a methodology which is really very interactive. So we focus and emphasize a cycle of learning, which we really focuses on capacity building, and we give our course participants the ability to learn some of the knowledge and the skills that we want to teach them for enhanced capacity. We privilege practicing, so they spend a lot of time in exercises in real scenarios that they're dealing with. In a lot of our programs, both the education and the security sector education programs, we have them develop national plans or project plans for various, addressing various threats. So, and then we spend a lot of time on reflection. And reflection means that we respect the fact that there's quite a bit of capacity on the ground. When I bring police officers from Pakistan in a room, and there's much less to teach them. They're all very educated and have a lot to contribute, but they don't have necessarily the space usually to reflect, think about, in a coordinated manner, with guided reflection, to think about how do I put a plan together in order to adopt a service-oriented ethos. For example, what are the resistance, the sources of resistance that I'll encounter in those types of issues. So we give them the space to reflect, we facilitate that reflection and get them to move forward onto whether it's a plan, a strategy, or those types of things. So that's what goes on into our courses. Our courses are being held, for the most part, we're actually branching out now, but for the most part at the Hidayah Center of Excellence for CVE in Abu Dhabi, which many of you probably know about, and we are working to strengthen their capacity to have an education and training ability for the entire world. So our methodology is very much, you come to our course and you engage with country teams. We usually bring a bunch of people from a particular country, and they have to spend 3 to 5 days working together to think about how they're going to address particular issues and how they can foster change when they go back home. So we have a couple of different pillars. One is policing. We call it policing for CVE, and we work with the police. We bring the police together from various countries. We've been working with Somalia, Pakistan, Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, and various others, Nigeria. And we're working with them to help them think about what kind of changes need to take place at the police institution, at the level of the institution, all the way down to the operational level, and what kind of changes need to take place so that they can be a service-oriented institution. This is what I meant earlier when I talked about the tools that we give, we impart on our participants, is we're trying to get them to organize themselves, to structure themselves, to provide a public service so that violent extremism can both be addressed and prevented. So we work to get them to think about what kind of changes do they need to make, what kind of policies need to take place, what kind of human resources structures need to be put in place, all those types of things which are we've been working on for years that can really address violent extremist threats. We really emphasize institution building. What are the types of things that need to take place? Most police officers that you talk to in maybe Tunisia and other places which are transitioning countries will say the biggest problem I have is that I have to respect human rights, because as Lena said, there are much pressure on them to respect human rights, but they don't know what that means necessarily, and they need to translate that respect for those guiding principles into policies and practices that everyone on the police force needs to be trained on, so that when they go out there and engage with the community, they behave differently. So we work with them. What does that mean? How does that translate into different practices, into different policies? So we've been in the process now of working with several of the countries to help them develop national plans for how to incorporate this service-oriented ethos. And we really tell them that this is an ethos, this is a philosophy. Much of the service-oriented police training that's been done in the past was at the operational level, sort of giving people, creating a division for community-oriented policing or community policing divisions, but to really get them to think about everything that the police institution does has to have a service-oriented ethos, even the hard policing, even when you go out and arrest a terrorist, even when you respond to, in a hostile environment, in a hostile situation. You have to think about communication, you have to think about partnering, about your partners, you have to think about the service orientation that you have. So that's the pretty challenging piece, but that's what we're working on with them. This is a sustained program that we've been running since 2013. We also help them address resistance, both from political establishment, legislative actors, and obviously the community who don't necessarily trust them or often don't trust them. There are some issues of legacies of the past, from places like Northern Ireland to Tunisia, and the police isn't necessarily trusted, and it's really difficult to turn into a different type of institution when it's the same faces that are in a different uniform. And we help them to shift their narrative. We help them to develop slogans, new slogans, as a promise of new service to the population, and a sort of rallying call for the types of changes in policies and practices that they need to make. So various slogans like the LAPD slogan, we serve and protect, that kind of thing. But it's something to get them thinking about what do we organize around. So that's some of the work that we're doing with the police. We're about to go to Abu Dhabi in May and work with Pakistan and with Somalia on furthering their national plans. We also have another pillar, which, as I mentioned, we work with the education sector. We bring in civil society and members and educators and ministry officials, and we teach them the role of, show them and get them to think and analyze about the push and pull factors that can lead to violent extremist activities. We get them to think about what kind of projects can they put together. Our colleague just came back from Abu Dhabi a couple weeks ago, where education professional and civil society actors came together and put together plans for projects that they're going to go home and implement. And we'll be engaging them again in the fall to further and address some of the issues that they've been facing. And then we also teach alternative approaches to address grievances, so nonviolent approaches, which we all know very well about in this room. But how do you address some of those things, and how do you teach those things to young people and people around in the society? We have a third leg to our program of instruction, and that's where we call it media and communication. And it's really the idea of how can communication, or how does communication play a role in either supporting violent extremism or in countering it. So just to bring them, get them to understand that the language, the messages, the branding that various organizations make are really important, and they have to be they have a strategic nature to them, and you have to be really careful and be very skilled in how you communicate and choose words. The ability to critically assess is also something that we give them to think about how can you assess information that's being out there. So there are all kinds of narratives to have a critical eye. There's a bunch of work that's been done on a lot of different groups, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, to really think about, okay, look at this narrative, but there's been a lot of work. The French actually just came out with a video just explaining what it actually means when you get to Iraq or various other places where ISIS is engaged, what your life actually looks like. And so to give them a critical eye on what the narrative is about. To develop, we also give them the skills to have communication strategies, to use the media. Candace is going pretty soon to teach on how do you communicate via the media, how do you send those messages, how do you set a new narrative, a new language. And finally, our fourth pillar is about community empowerment, and that's really to address issues of trauma, issues of legacies of violence in the community, and to really think about what, first for people to begin to understand and take back knowledge about what it means to have trauma and how crippling trauma can be for people, and how it limits their ability to counter violent extremism in a variety of different ways. We also teach them how to learn how to deploy new means of religious and cultural expression so that they do it in nonviolent ways. And we also help them develop an understanding of the impact and stress on the community, and help them develop strategies to promote the resilience of their entire community, so they can engage more actively. We talk about women groups, women, mothers, sisters, youth. When there's trauma, it's much more difficult to engage in those kinds of ways. So we really help them to understand, become aware of what they are facing, what they have, give them maybe coping skills so that they can begin to organize and resist and become resilient to the pull and the push factors of violent extremism. I'll stop here. I hope we have an interesting discussion. I'm happy to answer many more questions on these programs, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much to our three panelists. The programming sounds terrific, and Eric, the roadmap sounds very sensible, but I know you have to leave in a few moments, but I was wondering whether you can elaborate on the roadblocks that are currently being thrown up in front of you and this roadmap for progress.
Sure. I think the challenges are going to be more on the government responses than on empowering civil society. I think we will see lots of additional resources mobilized to support the work of Search for Common Ground and other civil society actors that are so critical to engaging in this space. We'll see more credible voices, credible messengers, whether it's youth, women, religious leaders identified. But I think where the rubber hits the road is, will we be able to get governments to open up their societies to more civil society engagement, more civil society empowerment? Will we see governments stop using the threat of violent extremism and terrorism more broadly to crack down on this very same groups whom we're trying to empower? Will we see governments stepping forward to actually meaningfully do more to address the grievances of their marginalized communities, to make them less susceptible to being drawn into the arms of violent extremist messages and groups who in some cases can provide services for marginalized communities. So I think it's not a secret what the challenge is. It's getting governments to change their behavior, recognizing that governments are often government behavior can be a key driver of violent extremism. And we're not Pollyannish about this endeavor. We don't expect governments to all of a sudden shift on a dime because of this process come September. What we do hope is that over time, if we stick with this for the next few years, that we see some progress on that front. But again, I think we're pretty clear-eyed what the obstacles are. But we still think, even with those obstacles, and if we don't make enough progress there, that simply creating more opportunities for civil society, more resources for civil society, more training for civil society, that will have been certainly a positive step forward.
Lena, can I flip that around? To what extent do you think that civil society organizations are willing to work with governments in the CVE space, particularly governments whose government records aren't exactly stellar?
No, it's a good question. I think there's two dynamics here. One is that in some of what I shared, we recognize that there has been less than optimal collaboration, and so that's why we've designed initiatives that seek to create a space for exchange and conversations to actually overcome those barriers. And many civil society organizations, notably human rights organizations, have been trained for 100 years about how to denounce abuses and how to whistleblow, and that can polarize relationships. So shifting that to actually enable people to say, we're all building a peace architecture, we're actually building something together, is also a way forward. But I would say the second dynamic is that the use of force and the use of violence by certain governments only reinforces the attraction of certain narratives and reinforces the validity of certain grievances. And so I think that there's another dynamic at play whereby we can offer millions or even billions towards CVE and peace-building approaches towards countering violent extremism, and yet what are the resources that are being used in other ways using kinetic force, and is that helping or hindering the process? And there's a lot of scrutiny about the effectiveness of civil society approaches to CVE work. We need tools and indicators and all those kinds of things. We're not perhaps also applying the same scrutiny towards the use of violent force as an effort to try to counter or to counter violent extremists.
And do you find members of the CT community amenable to your opinions on what they're doing right and perhaps even what they're doing wrong in this field?
Well, that's why I really want to say that I think that the February summit was a real turning point, because I felt as though if they're able to come up with an 8-point action plan, right, without having to have an entire caveat that says, in the meantime, we're still going to do all of these kinds of things. I mean, it's there in the declaration, but there's a real recognition and a commitment to pursuing these approaches. My engagement with different CT people, I don't think that right now in 2015, that they're going to do a parade about how successful military force has been in countering violent extremism. That's the place we're in at our moment in time in 2015. It doesn't necessarily mean that as a peace-building organization, we want to eliminate intelligence and security forces. Not at all. But the exploration and the inquiry about how can that use of force actually be contributing to the driving causes of violent extremism, which more and more people are understanding, is the central question today.
And Nadia, your perspective?
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think this is why we focus our efforts on trying to get the police services specifically, but other security forces, to get them to understand what kind of changes in behavior and conduct, working on code of conduct and those kinds of things, what needs to change for them to be able to do that. Again, I think that it's really important for the community to think really hard and fast about the types of training that we do and who we do it for, because, for example, human rights training by itself, just teaching the conventions and those types of things, don't really help a police officer to change their behavior on the ground. It needs to be, for the rest of us, if you go to New York City and you ask an NYPD officer, do you respect human rights? And said, I don't know, no, I don't know. Because with these guiding principles that have informed the policies and that have trained and that have then trickled down into training and various practices. So I think it's really important to focus on the government capacity, because I do agree that they can radicalize, they can make things worse, and they do give credence to the grievances. There's no doubt about it. Even in France, there were some good reasons, why these things happened, and there's a lot of exclusion and a lot of repression. So all over the world, we see that, and I think it is an issue of government capacity.
Okay. To what extent do the participants that you train in your policing, the participants you train in your policing course are receptive to the CVE tools that you provide? Do they see them as a legitimate tool in how they would perceive CVE in their particular context?
It's a long road. It's a long road ahead. But yes, I would say I've been engaging the same people since 2013. And the first time we were there, we had a couple of people who just said, please just send us drones. And please just send us drones, that's all we need. And we've worked, this is really what I mean by building capacity. We've worked on getting them to think, what is that going to do? What are the long-term effects? What is that going to do to society? Every terrorist has a mother who will now be inflamed if you kill them. And to get them to think that way, police officers all over the world face significant threats every single day, and they don't necessarily have the opportunity to think about things this way. So the idea is really to get them to think along. This is why I mentioned the issue of reflection, to move along in their thinking and their approach, and to have the skills to think a little bit more long term. So yes, they're willing. I just saw the same people 3 weeks ago, and they're no longer asking for drones. I've asked them to put a slogan together, for the Tunisians, their slogan was, your police changes with you. They're in transition period. It was very interesting. It was no longer a very, kinetic sounding sort of approach. So I think, yes, there's movement. Yes, there's openness, but then there's the how, right? I saw the Tunisians right after Bardo, 3 days after Bardo, and they were saying, that's fine, we can respect human rights, but how? Because we have some bad people out there that are, threatening to do this again. And the answer to how is different investigative practices. Different, when you're going to do interrogations, there are different ways. We have to bring that to them.
Okay. Lena, you spoke about your philosophy of no judgment. Does that impact at all your ability to access communities who do have judgments and would like to see some form of justice in the CVE space?
No, that's an interesting question. Again, that's the answer to that question, resonates with all of the work that we do, because we're every single day reaching out to people who actually feel as though the solution to their problem is the elimination of the other. And they feel like that very deeply, and they've been wounded, and they've been harmed, and they've lost family members. And so within the context of CVE, the approach of Search for Common Ground recognizes that, and recognizes that people will need to be accompanied through a process of feeling heard and recognized in their own sense of grievance or grieving or trauma before they're able to actually listen to another person. And when people feel as though human rights groups, again, that denouncing and whistleblowing and that kind of thing is an effective strategy, we're not there to say don't do that. We're also there to say there might be also some other ways of actually building common ground. And the only way to actually enable people to move beyond that sense of wanting judgment or punishment on the other is to enable them to actually feel as though they have shared interests. Until that point, it's very normal and natural, given the way that our societies are built, that we would feel as though the natural reaction or the justified reaction is to want the elimination or the punishment of the other. And so, but human beings actually have an incredible capacity to feel connected across these dividing lines. And that's the magic of doing this kind of work, is that we are actually able to touch into those common chords. But it's not an easy journey.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any final thoughts before I open it up to the audience for questions?
No, let's go ahead and do that.
So some questions? You're keen? Can I ask that you keep questions short and succinct, please?
Go to the microphone.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I'd like to ask your perspectives on in sort of active conflict zones like Syria and Yemen,
Thank you. I know I have a really soft voice. So in active conflict zones, places like Syria and Yemen, where the government and law enforcement structures have pretty much broken down, and so their ability to deliver services, to address grievances, to cooperate with citizens are limited to non-existent. What do you think the role of citizens and civil society groups and religious leaders and those sort of sectors still on the ground in the countries can be in CV, and what sort of skills or capacities do you think it can be helped to develop in those groups, within those contexts? Sort of what would a training for those type of groups perhaps look like?
Want to take one at a time?
Yeah, please.
No, go ahead.
Okay. No, it's a good question, and I think that once a conflict becomes violent so that it's difficult to implement, we for example, are barely keeping our work alive in Yemen right now, that there is an important role to actually continue to find ways to amplify these narratives of understanding of different perspectives. So that is something that can be done, for example, through the channels that are available, social media, the possibility of continuing to enable people to not become more polarized as a result of the conflict. And Yemen is a perfect example because people actually are very comfortable living with diversity in that country, and yet the people at war are trying to make the case that that's not the case. So it's a question of keeping that other narrative alive. In the case of Syria, I think ourselves and many other organizations have had challenges to work in the country, but we are working actively with Syrian refugees, knowing that this is a long-term protracted conflict, and that we will need to be able to help a conversation around identity and diversity and a shared future for the long term. But I don't want to underestimate the challenges of actually trying to do some of this work in an active conflict like Syria and Yemen. It's certainly not. If it was easier, we would be doing it, and we're not. It's not that we don't want to. It is very challenging, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's the same for us. That we can't get in there in those environments. But we do bring people out of those environments in various. We have a program right now that's going on in Morocco, where we're bringing this, security actors together for the region, North Africa region, and we're getting them to think. And these are government actors, for the most part, police professionals, and getting them to think about the types of engagements that they can make. I would say that one of the things to really think about, and I don't have proof that this works per se, but I'm really getting more and more behind the idea, is to bring people out of these environments and teach them how to partner already, right? To teach them how does police commissioner partner with a few community leaders, and get them to think about what terms of the partnerships, where the terms of partnerships could be, what each actor can do to mutually reinforce each other for more secure, situations. Hopefully in preparation for the cooling off of the conflict, because we see that the legacy issues are extremely difficult to deal with once a conflict has gotten a little colder. So it's really important. We all see it in Northern Ireland. They're very much 15 years after the Good Friday Agreement. There are still some significant legacy issues that are stopping a partner partnering with each other. There's mutual, disrespect and distrust. So I think it's really, it's important to think about how can we get people to begin to learn to work together, and to think about how they, one without the other can't provide security. There won't be a security without the two partnering together on a regular basis. So I think that that's an important thing to do, and then to think about the narrative, to think about language. How do we transform the language that's going to be used in the future all around the same themes?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. A kind of theme emerges from some of the comments that actually it might be easier to deal with the mid-level people, the police and so on, than with the central governments, which might be very intransigent. And are you able to get away with that when you have a really intransigent government that is a big part of the problem, and yet you are able to get in and talk to these mid-level local police?
Want me to take that? Yeah. So yes, it is, interestingly, what I see is that when you're working with the police, it is the middle that is the most receptive and sees the problem the best, right? Rank and file are having much harder time seeing the problem. They're out there in the street, and it's either he shoots me or I shoot him in lots of different places. So they have a much less perspective. We are beginning to engage parliamentarians, central governments, and in some of the countries where the government is centralized, there are fewer actors. And so we are engaging. We're engaging them in Tunisia. I have meetings with Pakistani parliamentarians that are here in town this week, this afternoon, to talk to them about the programs that we're doing in Pakistan, to get them to buy into the process and to get them to understand what they have to do to contribute to the changes that we're trying to promote. The greatest obstacle that the police professionals that we bring together state as the greatest challenge is the political establishments and political will for change. That's nothing new to anybody in this room, but we need to get them to understand how to get the buy-in. This is when I was talking about the resistance for change. That's where it comes from. And so how do you sell the idea of a new ethos? How do you, what is it going to do for the country in a way that's not as threatening to the political establishment? They have to leave the door open a little bit, and some people are going to make the changes. So we are beginning to engage at that level, but we're teaching police leadership to engage at that level also.
The gentleman up the back.
Excuse me. Ken Meyergorg, World Docs. One of the speakers, who I hope won't mind me referring to her as Lena, as I got here too late to learn how to pronounce her last name correctly, pointed out that the use of force by certain governments can promote violent extremism. I'm wondering if one of those governments is our own. Our leaders have a proclivity for resorting to violent means And if you believe violence breeds violence, trying to convince them that there are other ways to accomplish the same objectives, nonviolent ways, could be a productive way to reduce violent extremism.
Yes, yes. And I think that absolutely, it was funny because I got the impression that it is as though I was not referring to the US. Of course I'm referring to the US also, absolutely. And if we look at what's happened in the communities where there have been drone strikes in Yemen and Pakistan, you know, even the photo I showed of our young people we've worked with from KPK and Fatah, I mean, when you really listen to how they try to open a space of dialogue in an environment where friends and family members have been killed by drones, it's really hard for them to actually raise that or amplify a new narrative. It's really, really hard. So absolutely. And I think that over time, that was what I said earlier, I believe it is the moment for us to bring a level of scrutiny on some of these tactics around the use of force. Again, I would disaggregate, you know, intelligence and surveillance and all of that from actually the use of force. So absolutely.
Can I add something?
Yeah, Nadia?
And of course, I fully agree with that. But I think we also have to think about the indirect use of force, like foreign military sales, and think about our train and equip programs, and think about who are we arming, what kind of institutional capacity do they have to handle these types of assets that they're looking for. The first thing I always get asked is, can you get me tanks? Can you get me drones? Can you get me ammunition? And I always tell them, do you have a logistics management program? Do you have a human resource program? You know, and we need to build up institutions, but we need to make sure. So there's indirect violence also that's perpetrated by these foreign military sales, and I think that's also something to pay attention to.
The woman in the green shirt.
Kagan Ann, Charity and Security Network. I wanted to go a step further on the examining the effectiveness of the use of force to also raise another issue, which is sanctions and the theory of isolation, that by imposing sanctions or making it illegal to engage with listed armed foreign terrorist organizations, such as the prohibition on peace building with them, doesn't this also undermine effectiveness in the long term? And don't we need to look at some of the assumptions behind the sanctions and isolation theory?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and there's many people in our organization that are, you know, really thinking about how can we try and raise this, because certainly the kind of work that I've shared with you today has to be available to everybody, regardless of their viewpoint, and to not be able to work with certain groups will prevent the efficiency and the effectiveness of what we need to do. So I do think that this is an issue that more and more is being raised within the circles of peace-building organizations to see how might we find a win-win that looks at access to resources but does not prevent access to dialogue and other types of activities in that way. So, very important.
Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Chelsea Durham at GW. I have a question specifically in regards to the USIP training and education programs. What sort of evaluation is occurring to make sure that that theory of change is really playing out? What sort of indicators are you looking for to see if you're having the impact you hope to?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. And we're working hard on developing, you know, a pretty substantial tool for evaluation. As you know, that takes a little bit of time. You have to have, you know, we have a young program. But we do have some, the first thing we look at is we've had requests for repeat business, right? So in 2013, we got a whole bunch of countries together in Abu Dhabi, and we're still engaging them, and they're still coming, and we're engaging more and more people, and we're focusing now on, it used to be cohorts of 9 countries, and now we're down to just 1 country and 20 people from the various provinces maybe, and then the central government, and and those kinds of things. And there's just quite a bit of participation, and there is a significant amount of changing of the mindset that has occurred. So you can see that in the classroom when when you're having these discussions, you can see that the material is going into people's heads. They're wrestling with it. One of the indicators that we have is that we have people that have taken their plans back, whether it's our education program or policing programs. They're taking their plans back to their organization, their institution, and they're implementing them. But that's happening now as we speak, so we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see what the actual impact of those programs. But our impact, we feel that we're having an early assessment is that we're having a significant impact on people because they have been socializing the projects that they put together. They're coming back to further them, to figure out what are the additional pieces of this plan that need to be put in here so we mitigate some of the resistance and those kinds of things. So for now, that's where we are because obviously we have pre and post course evaluations, and we assess what people are learning, what we're giving them in terms of knowledge, and we see that we're giving them, they come away from our courses with knowledge that they didn't have before. We see that in the evaluations. But now on the ground, that's a much more complicated situation. And we always discuss, are we evaluating ourselves and the impact we're having on people we're bringing to us, or are we evaluating the impact of those individuals on the ground? And we're in the process of developing those tools.
Yes.
I'm Suzanne Gates with American University, and I'm pretty loud, so don't worry about it.
But it's for the webcast.
Oh, okay, certainly.
I have kind of a big picture question. It seems as though violent extremism has been on the increase in recent years, maybe 15 or 20 years. Do we know if that's in fact true? Or does it just feel that way because the media broadcast it more or something? And if it is true that violent extremism is on the rise, do we know why?
Do you want to answer that?
No. I think it's about branding. Is that kind of an inappropriate answer? I think that we're branding violent extremism because of who it's targeting, and that extremism, fascism, things that bring people into ideologies that make them want to eliminate masses of people or entire population groups is not a new phenomenon, right? And so is violent extremism, is that in a whole different subset as of genocide? Is that in a whole different subset as of, I feel as though while I welcome the way and the focus on violent extremism as it's being framed today, I think that we will be harming ourselves if we think that this is a completely new phenomenon that requires entirely new approaches and it's a new field. I feel it's a new way of speaking about the particular way of violent extremism, largely with a religious underpinning, is affecting certain parts of the world. But I don't feel, again, and we have the advantage of we address violent conflict in so many countries where those dynamics are not present, and yet the effect and the dynamic of that violent conflict is very, very similar, right? From South Sudan. I was recently in Juba, right? Is that not violent extremism, what's happened there since December 2013? Absolutely. And what is underpinning the extreme nature of that tribal identity-driven conflict is extreme violence. And the tactics to overcome that, we would draw on exactly the same toolbox here. We would just work with different stakeholders.
If I can add, I think what's made it a little different in the last 20 years is that the conflicts are much more complex, and we understand them a lot less, and we certainly don't know all the actors whom we need to know. The Cold War ended, and everything became a lot more complicated to understand, and I think that's what is driving perhaps part of the rationale behind your question.
And I think we have to think about immigration too. We have to think about the great migration of lots of people that are excluded in lots of different places. There's the other is not only in some places anymore. It's in a lot of different areas, and I think I don't know. I think some of the research agenda really should look at what's happening and how do we help governments integrate large amounts of immigrants. There's just a few people in a community that's not going to be the same as if you have a large influx. Northern Ireland has a significant problem of racism now against people, people of Muslim faith, people from Asia, because they're just becoming, they're coming in great numbers, so I think we should sort of probably pay attention to that trend also.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Diane Perlman, George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. In the winter of 2002 and 2003, my colleagues and I were all going on the radio and writing op-eds and lobbying Congress, warning basically that everything that happened would happen and that there would be, multiplication increase and spreading of terrorism and trauma. So, I appreciate that we're addressing that. And what we do a lot of the time, I think all of your programs are wonderful and valuable and helpful in making a difference in people's lives, but we're dealing with symptoms and rather than the cause and effect. So, and you mentioned that radicalization is deeply personal, but it's also deeply and widely collective, and there's a mass psychology to it. And you're addressing, grievances, stress, and trauma, but they all came from, a bigger primary cause. So, and there's also humiliation, envy, fear, moral outrage, lack of dignity, identity, sovereignty, and, these kind of basic, really deep, profound needs that are non-negotiable. So, in terms of policy, top-down policy, and we're still doing policies that are escalating cycles of violence. I also agree with the woman who mentioned about sanctions. So I wonder if there's any input into policymakers. One is to not do that, but there are also policies that we can engage in to try to reduce terror. Like I think the frame counterterrorism is also focused. Some of it is like going after bad guys, and it's concrete, black and white thinking, going after the symptom. I prefer to use terror reduction, and even things like apologies, which we're nowhere close to being able to do, or collective processes that are healing, in addition to stop increasing the problem to try to heal what we've already done. So is anybody doing anything on those dimensions?
I can't speak exactly concretely about who is doing what. I would just say two things. One is that I feel as though the opportunity of the CVE Summit does open a space to be able to, for peace-building organizations and universities and experts such as yourselves to actually begin to offer recommendations around policies. And the woman in the green shirt question about that was an example of, okay, that's all fine, but that won't be effective if we're still siloing off certain groups. And I think some of the other things that you're saying, there is a moment, I think, this year with the door that's been opened, with the fact that it's going to come up again over the next few months and in September, to actually, as a peace-building community, to offer certain recommendations around this. And I think that the door is open now. It's for us to step into that space.
Well, I think, if I may, we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq now for 14 years, and I think the CT community would readily acknowledge that it does not have all the answers and welcomes the inputs of civil society organizations, NGOs, people working in the non-securitized space. Yeah?
Who's that?
Yeah.
Both. Here we go. Here. Okay. Hi, my name is Sarah Smith. Bear with me, I was a bit late, but can you elaborate on any problems or challenges or excuse me, any efforts that are currently underway for Kenya in light of the conflicts between the ethnic Somali communities and the Kenyan forces?
I think we had a generic comment that one of the biggest challenge, the biggest elephant in the room is the question of political will. And do governments have it to continue working in the CVE frame? I don't think anyone spoke specifically about Kenya.
I would just add that I think it's very interesting because if you look at Kenya right now, the response was to bomb, and now the response is to close the refugee camp. And those two initiatives, as we all know, will radicalize people further. So how can we, as peace builders, open a space to actually begin to have a conversation that recognizes people's trauma, recognizes people's sense of injustice, recognizes that they feel as though they want to see people suffering or punished? And how can we transform that into a new discussion that brings everybody, including Somalis, both Somali Kenyans and Somalis, into this conversation? What's the role of civil society in that? And how can we enable the government to feel as though in engaging in that conversation, they're not going to lose face? And that, for me, is the key challenge right now for Kenya, because it actually could go terribly wrong. If they decide, they even said, I think, that they're going to themselves deal with the refugee camp if the United Nations doesn't do so. It's very extreme language, and this can drive a lot further conflict in that region.
I think there was a question behind.
Thank you. Alice Willman from the World Bank. We were part of the CVE summit at the White House in February, and we're kind of trying to get our head around this issue now a little bit more. So what you've been talking about has been super useful. And I was struck by what you said, Lena, about this, that you can bring a lot of the tools from basic conflict analysis or conflict sensitivity to bear on this problem. And so my question would be, is it different at all, or should we be encouraging our colleagues to just do conflict-sensitive development? It seems to me, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but that there are two qualitative differences between what we're seeing today with Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram and ISIS that are different than a lot of the armed conflict that we've seen in the past, which would be first the contagion effect that they have. They spread so fast, and they have people leaving, perfectly good lives in developed countries to go join. And the second difference would be that their stated ideology is all about wiping an entire, the whole idea of the modern state off the map. So it's not like you can sit down and negotiate some kind of peace agreement that has territorial concessions or makes them into a political party, the kinds of things that we had sort of done in the past with other types of violence. So I'd just be interested to see what you think the real differences are in terms of how we understand it and how we approach it.
No, that's a great question. And I think it's an opportunity to qualify also the comments I made earlier, because I do believe overwhelmingly that there is a huge value of all the peace-building learnings and best practices in tackling violent extremism. At the same time, that dimension of it being global and that the sparks are global and online and all of that is a phenomenon that we haven't tackled before. But it's really at a tactical level. So it's about how can we, whereby we used to look at hate radio, right, that has a transmitter, how do you look at social media and look at those dynamics? And in terms of the ideology, again, I'm not the person to say that this is the worst ever ideology that has ever, that we've known as a human race. I think it is all the things that you described it as, but the question is, what is making people feel aligned towards that? What is making people feel as though that is their way that they can express who they want to be in their lives? What is them, you said they're leaving a perfectly good life. Well, they don't think it's a perfectly good life, and that's exactly why they're leaving. And so it's by taking off that judgment and really understanding why are people actually rallying behind this, that we can learn. And I do think that there is a lot that can be learned from other experiences around fascism and around genocide and around other extremism that we've known over the past few hundred years. But the tactic of how it spreads and how it's organized is absolutely new, and that's where we need to understand that the same old won't work in this new environment.
Why don't we take two final questions? The young woman in the black jacket and the woman who's standing next to Nate.
Hello, I'm Lisa Shirk at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. It seems to me there's three paradigms for thinking about how peacebuilding, countering violent extremism, and counterterrorism go together. One is to say these are all trying to do the same thing and they're complementary. And I think most of the media would portray that. If they talk about peacebuilding, it's a complementary approach to counterterrorism. What we've heard this morning is that it's also an alternative to, so it's another path. But in my mind, and some of what you've said really challenges that really peacebuilding is really opposite. Our theories of change are opposite, and our analysis of what is driving extremism is opposite. And often, whether it's in Kenya with Al-Shabaab, or in Nigeria with Boko Haram, or with ISIS, the solution of counterterrorism actually undermines the peace building that is happening on the ground. So these things are actually in conflict with each other. They're not complementary. And I think that our peace building community, we have been very gentle because we are doing our own research and our own innovation and piloting new projects. But I think that we need to come to terms with the fact and really name that peace building really has a different analysis of the problem and a different theory of change, and that counterterrorism is undermining peace building.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lisa. I mean, I think you're right that we've been very hesitant because as peace builders we feel as though if we don't have these extraordinary results we can't say things. But as you know, I think us and many other organizations, we are measuring what we do. We measure it based on the theory of change, and we're not enough demonstrating how these. I sometimes don't call them counterterrorism because I feel like that's also sometimes used ambiguously, but in the way that you've described counterterrorism, or the bombing of Somalia, or the trying to close a refugee camp, that absolutely undermines the potential effectiveness of peace building. And we're not a field likes to sort of stand up and protest and denounce other actors. So the question is, how might we be able to open the conversation around that and enable different people to understand that? I mean, I think that there is an openness to understanding that because people really do want to see durable peace. Even the government of Kenya, that's really what they want. And so how to enable them to reflect on what might that action create, and how can you, again, coming back to saving face, how can you show strength in a way that is different? So it's very important. I think it's really the next phase of what we need to look at in exploring this issue.
Yeah, I agree. It is an important question to be asking, and I think it's, we really have to focus on violent extremism. We have to focus on the word violence and its violence. And I think we find that we've been dealing with that for a long time. Whatever the violence is, ultimately violence is, recognizable and I think it's really important to think about it that way, because a lot of times people think about violent extremism and thinking extremism by itself is bad. Not necessarily. Extremism can actually lead to change and to positive change. That's, people on the fringes introduce new ideas, and that's how we evolve. So I think in the community, you really have to think about the idea of violence. When we were starting to develop our programs, we asked ourselves, so we were supposed to develop tools for giving countries CVE capacity. What are we going to give them, right? What we're giving them is the way to educate people in a way where they think critically for themselves. We're helping people, the police, think about how do we, not exacerbate, violence. But we've been doing that. Those solutions have been there for a long time. And it just seems that in the work that I've been doing, it seems that we're taking various models like community policing, community-oriented policing, and those kinds of things, which has been, right now that's sort of the way forward and the solutions, but it's really about the violence. It's not so much about the extremism, and I think we really need to be having much more conversations about that.
And one final question.
Hello, my name is Ariel Emer with Department of State. So each of you had talked about incorporating women into your programming, and I wonder if you could provide a little bit more detail about how women can contribute to CVE and what challenges you've faced in your efforts.
Women that, for example, for police, women can de-escalate a situation much better than men. Most police departments say that. That's not my quote. So bringing women into the security forces, into the police, is a very significant source of change, will really make a difference. And police conduct changes when there's a woman that's part of a patrol or an operation. And then we also need women at the strategic level so that when in planning of operations and planning of responses and planning of new strategies, those actually look different when women are involved. So I would say that that's the one thing that is really, really important. But it's also very, very challenging. As you know, we have, recruiting women in the security forces and specifically the police is first and foremost dangerous to the woman in some places. And so it's really important to do this sensitively and to get buy-in for it before you do these kinds of things. So that's the very first, piece that I would offer. That it's just bringing women into their different skills, their different approach to violence, and their in these types of environments, they have a different aura. They're seen differently by people that would engage, whether it's mass protests and violence and those kinds of things. Women actually have been able to de-escalate situations and to help sort of control the way male police officers are engaging. Male police officers will behave differently, and so the outcome becomes different. So I think that when bringing women into the police force will actually help this radicalization problem that the police has.
I would just add, it's an important question. So a couple of things that we recognize in our work is that just in understanding the drivers of violent extremism are very locally and based in the context, equally understanding women as recruiters, recruitees, or influencers is very, very context specific. So the first approach that we take is to actually understand what's the nature of the nexus between women's role in society and the recruitment or influence around violent extremism. And then the second interesting question that we're exploring is there's actually been a lot of work that positions women in a certain way in the peace-building field. So we're asking ourselves the question, are all of those assumptions valuable moving forward for this kind of work, or are there other dynamics at play? And how might we better understand issues around vulnerability to extremist narratives within women and girls? What might we understand about the way that women in certain societies are more able to access social media than in other contexts? And so we're actually at a point of really asking ourselves some questions. Yes, we have women, religious leaders that we engage with in the countries that I mentioned, absolutely, but I feel as though the identification of really what that theory of change looks like moving forward it remains to be explored further.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists. And before you go, I think you were each given a feedback card. If you could please fill it out, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very, very much.